सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। असतो मा सद्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय मृत्योर्मामृतंगमय। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्ति। Let us bow down to Sri Ramakrishna, the embodiment of all religions, the Supreme God Incarnate. Let us pray to Him to lead us from the unreal to the real, to lead us from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge, to lead us from death to immortality. Today's topic: how to achieve spiritual progress. We should have very strong aspiration for spiritual life. We are sure to achieve the progress, because the strong spiritual aspiration urges to undertake spiritual practices with great zealousness. Every moment is very propitious, is very important, very auspicious for the one who takes spiritual life seriously. Every moment is precious. That means it is most valuable. One should be able to use the time very appropriately. That means you must pay 100% attention to what spiritual practices you are doing every day. The idea is you have to dwell constantly on the spiritual theme. You must constantly remember the spiritual goal which you have set in your life. These things ought to be properly attended. Then only you may expect the spiritual progress. Spiritual progress depends entirely on the purification of your samskaras. That is, getting rid of all bad vasanas, the bad tendencies, is the most important thing that everyone will have to do in order to make spiritual progress. There are a number of spiritual ideas in our scriptures. Sri Ramakrishna has said many things for the spiritual aspirant to follow. Take any one of those ideas and try to live the life. Then you will see how you can make progress in the spiritual life. It may be viewed from another angle also. Man is a curious amalgam of matter and spirit. Man's body and mind are products of matter. Mind is also a matter. But the Atman is non-material. This Atman is the essential man. When you refer to a person, you are referring to this Atman. When I say I really belongs to, refers to, indicates to the Atman, which is entirely different and distinct from this body, from this mind. But somehow, for reasons we don't know, we have been dominated by both body and mind, because they are dominating us in every way. We are not even aware of the existence of the Atman. But it is possible through the practice of spiritual disciplines in a regular way to bring about a revolution in the whole situation. Then you will make the Atman rule over the body and the mind. The process of bringing this about together, with the consummation of this process, is known as spiritual life. So, deliberate, ardent, determined, and purposive movement towards God seeing, towards Atman realizing, constitutes preparation for entry into spiritual life. The consummation of this process is the fulfillment of spiritual life. So we should know exactly the concept of spiritual life. Spiritual life is indeed a hero's job. It is a job of an inner revolutionary within man. There are two words: spiritual life, life of the Spirit, and in the Spirit. Those who speak, those who think about spiritual life, they should think these words very carefully. Those who seek the inspiration of religion and want to build up a spiritual life are in a higher state of evolution than the mere animal. What we need to know, we are mainly psychophysical beings. Our life is both physical and mental. Through the cultivation of the mind, we come to know that life is more than matter and mind. There's a higher principle involved in life. Call it by any name you want. God, Atman, Brahman, Rama, Krishna, Shiva, call by any name. First we know of this fact theoretically. But a time comes when this theoretical knowledge exercises a tremendous hold on our mind and we become anxious to actualize this fact in life. We want to see God. We want to realize in experience the fact that our true being is not the body and the mind, but the Atman. In an absolute sense, that alone can be the meaning of spiritual life. Only after actually experiencing the Spirit or the Atman can our life be really spiritual. Only after seeing God can one live a life that is truly divine. But here, we are not going to use the term spiritual life in this absolute sense. For our purpose, we shall use the term spiritual life in a relative sense. Meaning, the sincere strivings of a true seeker to realize the Atman or to see God. That is what we mean by spiritual life. When we think of reality in a personal way, we call it God. When we think of it in an impersonal way, we call it Atman or Brahman. They are all interchangeable terms in an absolute sense. So, self-realization, God-realization, attainment of illumination, liberation, nirvana, all these words spiritually mean the same thing. The final meaning is the same. Whoever reaches the highest state in samadhi experiences the highest truth. We have mentioned that spiritual life is a hero's job. It is a job of the revolutionary, for it really means inner revolution. So that means one should be really strong, one should not be undecided, one should not be undetermined. These are all very important to build up your spiritual life. Simply telling, oh, I'm not feeling any progress in spiritual life. You will not have any spiritual progress if you don't give attention to the points which I have just mentioned. Spiritual life is to be lived upon in all earnestness, in all seriousness, with all sincerity. Spiritual life is not for the drowsy, not for a careless person, not for the one who is not very particular about discipline. Spiritual life is for the awakened and the determined. This awakening is given to us by the spiritual masters, by incarnations of God, by holy people. They keep on coming and trying to kindle our hearts. Somehow that kindling should be done. Once that is done, then the rest of the things we have to build up our life. Sri Ramakrishna gave personal instructions to the disciples. He would go and wake them up at 3 a.m., telling them, go and sit for meditation. No more sleep. Go now. Don't waste your time in sleeping. Sleeping you will have, no doubt. Meditation you can't have. So, go now and do meditation. So not only he awakened them, he initiated them, not only he gave them the glimpse of spiritual joy, but he made them live the life properly. That you can see if you study life of Sri Ramakrishna and his disciples. That means spiritual life is for that person who is ready to go through all the rigors, who is ready to pass through pains and lacerations of life in a continuous and unbroken process of self-regeneration. One cannot earn spirituality until one sheds off the worldliness, until one really cries for God. Ramprasad, a great mystic, he says to the Divine Mother, "O Mother, I have put my sleep to sleep. I stay awake ever and anon through yoga." A great spiritual mystic. So, a spiritual seeker asks in all earnestness, who am I? Whither do I go from here? What does all this mean? When a person stays on the physical level, nothing seems to him so queer and meaningless as the strivings of a spiritual seeker. But those who live the spiritual life, those whose illusions have been knocked out, those whose sleep of self-hypnosis has been broken, for them spiritual life holds out the most tremendous attraction. Well, no one can escape spiritual life for all time to come. How long you will play? How long? You have to become tired of playing. You have to. That's a law. As spirit is inherent in person, so spiritual life also is inherent in the person. Nothing in the universe is more inevitable about man than that someday or other his spirit will have full sway over the material part of his being. The degree of this sway of the spirit over the material part of our being marks the stages of spiritual progress in one's life. In order to find out how spiritual progress is made, we have always to turn to those who have walked all the way from the common human state of their being to the fully illumined state. It is only from the illumined souls, from saints and incarnations of God, that we shall learn in this matter. That's why It's very important for those who seek spiritual life seriously. They should live in association with holy people. Generally speaking, there are two sets of teachings on this issue. One set points out very clearly what prevents spiritual progress. Another, what helps spiritual progress. Both sets of teachings are equally important. Now, what are the factors which impede spiritual progress? That we should know in order to rectify our life. Sri Ramakrishna says with the greatest emphasis that if there is theft in the chamber of attitude, one cannot make spiritual progress. By the words theft in the chamber of attitude means duplicity of heart or variance in profession and practice. The person whose thoughts, whose words, whose actions have no relation to one another has not yet stepped up into the precincts of the spiritual life. Secondly, a self-despiser cannot make spiritual progress. Under all circumstances, whatever may be one's faults and sins, one must maintain a basic regard for one's essential being. One must also have a confidence in one's capacity to have the full and final illumination. That confidence is very important for doing anything. A man without faith cannot make spiritual progress. That is another third point. Because faith is the root and foundation of spiritual life. Fourthly, I am pointing out the things which prevent us in spiritual progress. He who cultivates the habit of picking faults at another cannot make spiritual progress. Why? Because this habit of picking out fault at others fills him with impurities of others' minds, not to mention the impurities of his own mind, which he already has. So by constantly thinking of faults in other people, you become more impure than anybody else, because you are constantly meditating on those faults. The moment you see a person, you see the fault. So, that is very dangerous in our spiritual progress. Another point is, one who is habitually hurrying and worrying, he cannot make spiritual progress. Such a person has a state of mind which is not conducive to proper practice of spiritual disciplines, such as concentration and meditation. How can he ever think of concentration? A man who is in a state of hurriness and worrying all the time, how can he ever think of concentration? He may talk about concentration meditation, but they are mere words. Words, just as you find those words in the books, you find those words on your tongue. Unless you practice, they mean nothing. And another important point is one must be ready to follow the discipline, not simply trying to live a soft life. That's the point. So, struggles have also important play in our life. If a seeker has no inner struggles, he is then perhaps degenerating by making truce with his lower nature. Subjugation of our lower nature does not depend on any freak of chance. It is a result of laborious self-application and practice of prescribed disciplines. Another point is, one whose senses are not controlled cannot make spiritual progress. Lord Krishna says in the Gita, chapter 2, verse number 67, he says, Indriyanam hi charatam en manonu vidiyate tadasya harati prajnam vayunnavimavambhasi. The mind which follows in the wake of the wandering senses carries away his discrimination as a wind does a boat on the waters. When discrimination is lost, spiritual progress is no longer possible. Once a party of drunkards wanted to have a boat ride. So they were all in a very happy mood because they will have a good boat ride. It was hot summer, and so they all grouped together, all like temperaments. So before starting this venture, they went to a liquor shop, have nice fill. Then all of them went to a boat. You know, their spirit, enthusiasm, they were all doubled up. They were feeling extremely enthusiastic and highly spirited that alcohol can provide. So they were in a very different state of mood. Whole night they are singing merry songs, and they were rowing the boat. When by the dawn their intoxication wore off, to their utter surprise they found that they had not moved an inch from the place they had started. Why? Simply because they had forgotten to weigh the anchor. So, it's a very important lesson here. Those who do not weigh the anchor cannot make spiritual progress. Taking up the anchor in spiritual life means uprooting the ingrained evil tendencies within us through proper ethical culture. That's the point. Kathopanishad tells a very significant teaching. Navirato duscharitan nashanto nasamahitaha. Navirato duscharitan nashanto nasamahitaha nashanta manaso vapi prajnanenaiva mapniyat. He who has not first turned away from wickedness, who is not tranquil and subdued, and whose mind is not at peace, cannot attain the Atman. So firm ethical foundation is needed, which we conveniently avoid. Moral turpitude effectively prevents us from fixing our gaze on the Supreme. With a blurred vision, we can't apprehend the real. So we find that all the great spiritual masters of the world laid the greatest emphasis on the necessity of fixing the foundation of spiritual life deep into the base of sound ethical culture. In Hindu religions, ethical culture has given deep attention to all the details of human thought, conduct, and action. It is pointed out that for making spiritual progress, the aspirant's life and conduct should be grounded in ethical culture. There's a famous Yajnavalkya Smriti. We have got many Smritis. Yajnavalkya, one of the great rishis, lawgivers, he says, truthfulness, absence of theft, absence of anger, modesty, purity, intelligence, self-possession, self-control, restraint of the senses, learning. This is declared to be the whole of dharma. In Sanskrit, the word dharma is frequently used to connote the word ethics. An aspirant who doesn't manifest these virtues as strands of his character cannot enter the inner precincts of spiritual life. These ethical qualities are cultivated through wakeful self-application. When the spiritual aspirant is grounded in ethical culture, he will spontaneously manifest what Lord Krishna tells in the Gita, chapter 16, verses 1 to 3. They are classified as Daivi Sampat. Abhayam Sattva Samshuddhir Jnana Yoga Vyavasthitihi Dhanandamascha Yajñascha Swadhyayastava Arjavam Ahimsa Satyamakrodha Tyagashantirapaishunam Daya Bhuteshvaloluptvam Madhavam Hrirchapalam Tejakshamaadhati Shaucham Adroho Natimanita Bhavanti Sampadam Daivim Abhijatasya Bharata. He has distinctly said these virtues are to be cultivated by the spiritual seekers. Fearlessness, purity of heart, steadfastness in knowledge and yoga, charity, control of senses, yajna, reading of the scriptures, austerity, uprightness, non-injury, truth, absence of anger, renunciation, tranquility, absence of calumny, compassion to beings, uncovetousness, gentleness, modesty, absence of fickleness, boldness, forgiveness, fortitude, purity, and absence of pride. So, we should know, we should evaluate ourselves whether we are practicing these virtues in our life before we become restless about spiritual progress. It will be seen that some of the ethical virtues are included by Lord Krishna as divine qualities. And at the same time, there are other qualities which are listed among the divine ones. This indicates that without being ethical, one cannot be spiritual. But being spiritual is more than being ethical. That's the point. The one thing that distinguishes the spiritual from the ethical is the awareness of the fact of God or the Atman. For example, there is an atheist. He can be an ethical person. An atheist can be an ethical person, but he cannot be a spiritual person in the truest sense of the term. Being spiritual is concerned with the spirit. A person to be spiritual must not only be ethical, but also be emotionally aware that he has a relation to God, or he must have at least an apprehension that there is more to him than his body and mind, which cannot be perceived by sense organs. Next point is, extremes of life must be avoided. Extremes of self-indulgence or self-mortification, they are all obstacles in spiritual life. Lord Krishna so warns in the Gita, chapter 6, verses 16 and 17. Natyasnatastu yogosti natayikanta manasnataha nachati swapnashilasya jagrato naivacharjuna. Yuktahara viharasya yukta chestasya karmasu yukta swapnavabodhasya yogo bhavati dukkha. These are the two verses. Yoga is not for him who eats too much. Yoga is not for him who eats too little. Yoga is not for him who sleeps too much. Yoga is not for him who sleeps too little. Then, for him who is temperate in food and recreation, in his effort for work, and in sleep and wakefulness, yoga becomes the destroyer of misery. Yoga means real spiritual progress. Lord Buddha also in his famous teachings on the middle path emphasizes the same truth. One who tries to overshoot his mark cannot make spiritual progress. There is such a thing as a time factor in spiritual life which has to be respected. It is wrong to ask for an experience before we are prepared for its recognition. In other words, for preoccupation with and over anxiety for spiritual progress is not conducive to spiritual progress. Sri Ramakrishna tells in the Gospel, The mother bird does not break the shell until the chick inside the egg is matured. What a fine example. The egg is hatched in the fullness of time. It is necessary to practice some spiritual disciplines. There is no way. Sri Ramakrishna further teaches about the efficacy of step-by-step progress. It is just like learning writing by drawing big scrawls before he tries to master a smaller hand. Sri Ramakrishna tells in the Gospel. So a person must acquire the power of mental concentration by first fixing the mind upon forms, and when he has attained success therein, he may easily fix it upon formless later on. A marksman learns to shoot by first having big objects to shoot at, and as he acquires more and more facility in shooting, he aims at more and more easily at the smaller marks on the target. So, when the mind has been trained to become fixed on images having form, it is easy for it to become fixed upon things that have no form. Patanjali, another great Maharshi, has said in the Raj Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi, 8 limbs. In the practice of yoga, the aspirant should not try to skip over steps in order to reach a higher step. For example, the first discipline Patanjali Maharshi prescribes is Yama. Yama consists of non-killing, that is practice of non-killing, truthfulness, non-stealing, continence, non-receiving. These constitute Yama. Patanjali calls this particular discipline Sarvabhauma Mahavrataha, universal great vows unbroken by time, place, purpose and caste rules. Those who have not steadily and correctly practiced even the first discipline, which I just mentioned, Yama, should not expect to attain Samadhi, the state of illumination. It is emphasized in these negative teachings that in a certain state of mind, spiritual progress is not possible. When that state of mind is changed for the better, the same person who was a victim of many obstacles can make wonderful spiritual progress. This is how it has become possible for sinners to become saints. What these negative teachings point out? Sri Ramakrishna, in one of his parables, he says, once a farmer wanted to bring water from a reservoir to his sugarcane field. They do this in the countryside of India with the help of a long wooden contrivance. Water is ejected from the reservoir with the help of that wooden contrivance, which is manually operated. Water passes through a drain connecting the reservoir and the field. Now this farmer ejected the water during the whole day. Then in the evening, he came to see how the field was irrigated. But to his utter surprise and shock, he found that the field was as dry as it was before. Because not a drop of water had entered the field throughout the whole day. How could this happen? On examination, he found that all the water had vanished into the earth through several big rat holes at the entrance of the field. All these negative teachings point out the rat holes which drain away the results of all our spiritual practices. We may work hard, but unless these rat holes are properly closed, the field of our life cannot be spiritually irrigated. That's the point. When on self-examination we find that we are not only stagnating but degenerating too, though we have been in spiritual life for long, it is time we make a search for rat holes in our life and close them properly. This is one of the most practical lessons for spiritual life given by Sri Ramakrishna. Now coming to positive steps for making spiritual progress. I told two sets of teachings. Now I am coming to the positive steps. It is a truism to say that spiritual progress presupposes a start in spiritual life. How does spiritual life start? Each individual's conscious spiritual life may begin in a different way. But there is a general law behind all the varying positions of a start in spiritual life. It starts with a felt want within, which of the soul, the intimation of the Atma. In this inner situation, one is required to believe, for the sake of survival, that behind the universe seen, there is something unseen which holds and sustains this universe. Within this body there is something more and greater which moves both the body and mind. This compelling inner requirement leads one eventually to an act of faith that there is a God and that only through seeing Him and being in and for Him alone can life attain its meaning and fulfillment. Also, that there must be a way of seeing Him because He has already been seen by others. The actual start in spiritual life would be when we turn away from all evil ways of life and resort to that which is good. We must remember that no one can attain the spiritual by bypassing the ethical. The aspirant does this groundwork in his own mind through the creative cultivation of an enlightened code of living. Code of living. He conserves his mental energy by philosophically accepting certain proven inevitables of life. What are they? Disease, old age, death, change of fortunes, and the operative force of the law of karma. These are all inevitables. You have to accept them. He sees the futility and harmfulness of harboring any kind of pride or possession, pedigree or accomplishment. This helps him to attain a degree of inner calmness. He converts ethical precepts into conduct and trains himself to be scrupulous, conscientious, detached, frank, straightforward, free from ill will to anyone. He is no longer easily pushed around by outer forces. He becomes like an anvil, stands firm on his own ground and transmutes his power of faith into a dynamic inner force. Through cultivating conscientiousness, he throws out from his life the grip of wrong thoughts, words or deeds. He energetically discards what is wrong and more energetically adopts what is right. Now being in a position to cultivate his developing power of insight, he better understands the true nature of things and thus cuts the roots of delusion and sorrow. Sri Ramakrishna now tells how it is important to have the guidance of the Guru. If people feel sincere longing, they will find that all paths lead to God. But one should have nishtha. Nishtha. It's a very significant word in our spiritual life. Nishtha means single-minded devotion. It's also described as chaste and unswerving devotion to God. It is like a tree with only one trunk shooting straight up. Promiscuous devotion is like a tree with 5 branches. Sri Ramakrishna tells the devotion of the wife to her husband, the ideal wife and ideal husband, is an instance of unswerving love. She feeds her brothers-in-law as well. She looks after their comforts. But she has a special relationship with her husband. Likewise, one may have that single-minded devotion to one's religion, one's own chosen deity, but one should not on that account hate other faiths or other gods, other forms of gods. On the contrary, he should have a friendly attitude towards them. Remember this example of husband and wife. Without this chaste and unswerving devotion to God, one cannot really make any headway in spiritual life. Again, it is important that this unswerving faith also be devoted to wholeheartedly cultivating the essentials of the faith. By mere study of scriptures, one may have clarification of ideas, sometimes confusion also, if you read too many books. But what is needed for growing spiritually is diving deep. Sri Ramakrishna tells, dive deep. One does not get the precious gems by merely floating on the surface. God is without form, no doubt, but He also has form. By meditating on God with form, one speedily acquires devotion. Then one can meditate on the formless God. It is like throwing a letter away after learning its contents and then setting out to follow its instructions. Lord Krishna says in the Gita, chapter 16, Yashastra vidimutsrajya vartate kamakaratah nasa siddhimavapnoti nasukanna parangatim tasmat shastram pramanante karya karye vasthitau gyatva shastra vidhanoktam karma kartum iharhasi. The meaning is, he who is setting aside the injunctions of the scriptures acts under the impulse of desire, attains not to perfection, nor happiness, nor the goal supreme. So, let the scriptures be your authority in ascertaining what ought to be done and what ought not to be done. Having known what is said in the injunctions of the scriptures, what's the immediate step you should do afterwards? You should act. Act upon what you have learned. How to bring the teachings of the scriptures into the stream of life for becoming spiritually transformed. Sri Ramakrishna tells in the Gospel, there are many scriptures like the Vedas. But one cannot realize God without austerity, without spiritual discipline. God cannot be found in the six systems, the Vedas or the Tantra. But one should learn the contents of the scriptures and then act according to their injunctions. That's why that example of the letter which Ramakrishna has said is very significant. Once a man lost a letter, he could not remember what he had left it, where he had left that letter. He wanted to know the contents of the letter. Without seeing the contents, he was a little worried. He began to search for it with a lamp. 2 or 3 people were engaged in searching. Finally, the letter was found. Then he opened the letter. He read the message. What was the message? Please send us 5 pounds of sweets and a piece of wearing cloth. That was the message. The man read it and then threw the letter away. There was no further need of that letter. He doesn't have to preserve that letter. Now what he should do? All he had to do was to buy the 5 shares or 5 pounds of the sweets and a piece of cloth. That's all what is to be done now. Better than reading is hearing, and better than hearing is seeing. One understands the scriptures better by hearing them from the lips of the Guru or a holy person. Then one doesn't have to think about their non-essential part. Hanuman said once, "Brother, I don't know much about the phase of the moon or the position of the stars. I just contemplate Rama." But seeing is far better than hearing. Then all doubts disappear. It is true, many things are recorded in the scriptures. But all these are useless without the direct realization of God, without devotion to His lotus feet, without purity of heart. Again, Sri Ramakrishna gives another example. The almanac forecasts the rainfall of the year. But not a drop of water will you get by squeezing the almanac. It must never be forgotten that life is proverbially short and uncertain. And inner and outer impediments on the spiritual path are many. So it makes no sense, serves no purpose to waste time in haphazard, willful and futile experiments. Here exactly arises the need of the guidance and help of the spiritual teacher. Sri Ramakrishna said, have faith in the Guru's words. One attains God by following the Guru's instructions step by step. It is like reaching an object by following the trail of the thread. So when you understand all these factors, then you will know what exactly spiritual progress means. Then only you will know how to achieve the spiritual progress. Thank you. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunakto Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om. May the Divine Spirit protect us, guide us, give us strength and right understanding. May we not hate one another. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. May the Divine Lord protect us. May He nourish us. May we work in harmony with great vigor. May our study be illuminating and fruitful. May we not hate each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.